Pivot tables are an age-old staple of Excel for users of all stripes. However, they have received a significant upgrade with the inclusion of the Excel data model. In this lesson, I'm going to cover how to create pivot tables from raw data dumps as well as the Excel data model. And further, we'll look at how to construct and interpret pivot table reports. Pivot tables take a dataset and basically smash it together and generate summarizations of the results based upon the defined structure. Rather than talking about this structure at length, let's go create a pivot table from a simple dataset using one of the tables from our invoicing data. I have a temporary worksheet to create a basic pivot table in. To create a pivot table, we're going to go to the Insert tab and we're going to choose the Pivot Table button. The resulting window will offer 3 different data source options. Select a table or range, use an external data source, or use this workbook's data model. For this first table, I'm going to select a table or range, and I'm going to click inside the box, and then I'm going to navigate to my line item worksheet, and I'm going to select the line item table, and press OK. This creates the original standard type of pivot table from a singular dataset. Within the pivot table, there are 4 classes of fields, which can be seen to the right in the Pivot Table Fields window. They're filters, columns, rows, and values. So let's discuss each of these. There's not really a good starting place, so I'm going to construct a report and then we'll deconstruct the components. I've placed 1 field each into the filters, columns, rows, and values areas. In the columns field, I've placed product ID. What this has done is across the top of the pivot table, it's listed each of the product ID possibilities in a single column. Similarly for the rows, I added the client field column, which has listed each of the client options going down as 1 per row. The column and row entries allow you to organize data into a tabular format, where the values identify the intersection of those 2 rows. So the 65.77 represents the point at which product ID 2 and client code 4 intersect. Since these values are the sale price, you can see that there are many blank cells as well. These cells indicate where there's not a matchup between the product ID and client code, as there wasn't any data. The values field itself can have different types of summarizations. In this case, it's taking the sum of the field, but that can be changed to the average, the count, or any other number of functions. To do that, within the Values section, you can click the down arrow, choose the Value Field settings, and pick the approach to summarize the value field by. I'm going to change this to average and press OK. And then, to get an idea for what this means, I'm going to remove the product ID from columns. Now each row represents simply the average sale price for a given client, so you can see what the average sale price to each client has been. Now the power of the pivot table is that you can quickly make these changes on the fly. So right now I'm looking at client code, but I can quickly just drag and remove client code, drag and replace it with product ID, and see what the average sale price for each product was. Now this leaves our filters field to discuss. Throughout this whole time, I've had the quantity field up here, and it's been selected at all. This field will apply a universal filter against the report to limit it to a specific subset of data. So I can select this drop-down and click 1 and press OK. And what this does is the new result filters the information down to only products and sales prices where the quantity was equal to 1. Now obviously this pivot table is fairly limited since I'm only using our line items table, and so it's missing all kinds of information that we would find helpful. In previous versions of Excel, users would need to manually construct a unified table that contained all of the information necessary for the pivot table. However, with the Excel data model, that is no longer necessary with the appropriate relationships built in. With that in mind, let's go build a power pivot table that uses our data model. For this, I'm going to another new worksheet, and I've called it Sales Report New. Again, I'm going to go to the Insert tab, and I'm going to select Pivot Table. This time, instead of using a table or range, I'm going to use this workbook's data model. I'm going to press OK. The first noticeable difference between the prior pivot table and this pivot table is in the field options. The previous fields were listed out, while this one has organized all of the available fields based upon each of the tables that the fields belongs to. Clicking the down arrow next to the line items reveals the fields that we had previously used. However, we now have access to the fields from other tables as well. What does this mean for us? Let's create a slightly more informational version of our previous pivot table. Starting with our line items table, let's put the sales price in the values field again, quantity in the filters, and product ID in the rows. Then I'm going to filter to a quantity of 1. As you can see, the table is identical to before. Now, however, I'm going to go to my products table, and I'm going to take the description field from the products table and use it as my rows. And I'm going to get rid of product ID. Since my description follows my numbering system, you can see that I've now brought in a field from a completely separate table and used it in conjunction with the line item table. The pivot table is doing a lookup that uses the product ID from the line items table to identify the description from the products table. This lookup is performed based upon the relationship that we've defined, where the product ID from the line items table is related to the product ID in the products table. So what else does that mean for us? Well, that means that we can use this pivot table to effectively recreate a vast majority of our invoice. So let's go look at what our invoice looked like. On our old report, we filtered based upon the client code to identify the list of product descriptions, the price they were sold at, the quantity they were sold at, the cost of the goods, and then the revenue, total cost, and net profit or loss. To get to this type of a format, we'll have to lay out our pivot table to replicate the results while simultaneously adding some additional calculations to our pivot table to recreate all of the fields. So, can we do each of those things? Yes, but it'll take 2 lessons. For now, our client code functions as a filter, so I can come to our pivot table, find the client list in our tables, and use client code as a filter. I'm going to get rid of the quantity since it's no longer necessary. To simplify our pivot table and keep it readable and examinable, I'm going to select one of the client codes. Since that's how invoices work anyways, I'll just select this one here, and it generates a result of about 5 entries. The description is part of the information I'm interested in, so I can leave it as is. The remaining components that we need all seem to be value items. The sales price, quantity, and cost of goods sold are all values. So I can drag quantity to my values quite easily from my line items table, and my pivot table looks good so far. But what happens when I add cost of goods sold from the products table? All of a sudden, I have a cost of goods for all descriptions, despite having filtered down to a specific client code. As a value, this is going to apply to all products, so I have an invoice that no longer makes sense. So instead of defining it as a value for this lesson, if I move it to the rows section and remove it from the values section, I now get a cost of goods sold that applies only to the price and quantity combination. But now our format looks pretty funny. Pivot tables come with a wide variety of formatting options for how you might want to lay the visuals out. This is the standard outline form, where the top of each row actually represents a subtotal, as the upper level indicates the product description, while the next level shows each of the detailed components, which in this case is based on the cost of goods sold. We can change this layout by going to the Pivot Table Tools Design tab and choosing Report Layout and using the tabular form. The tabular form lies it out in a more table-type format you might expect of a table of this type, where the description, then the cost of goods sold, and then the value fields show up with a subtotal beneath each row. Now we don't want the subtotals here, so we can go to our subtotals option and choose Do Not Show Subtotals. And now our pivot table looks very much like our invoice table that we might expect. But now we're missing the revenue, cost, and profit components. The problem here for us is that we will not be able to create these measures within the pivot table itself. We'll have to use the Power Query functionality, which we'll cover in the next lesson. So for now, let's cover a few more of our pivot table options and features. First, pivot tables can use slicers, just like data tables can. The Insert Slicer can be found on the Pivot Tables tool under the Analyze tab. Additionally, while slicers allow you to filter a pivot table's summarization down, there's a drill down option that allows you to get at the heart of a data subset. With that in mind, I'm going to clear this client code filter, and if I double click on any value cell, such as widget 03 sum of sale price, I get a list of all of the different entries that corresponded to create that cell. So if I look at the report, the sum of sale price was $32.74. I can add these fields, and the total is $32.74. This gives you a quick and easy way to dive into the details for a specific cell if the need arises. Since I don't need this table, I can delete this worksheet and return to the pivot table. Now, one of the newer features for pivot tables is the timeline feature, which works very much like a slicer, except across date and time information. To insert a timeline, you can go to the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab and choose Insert Timeline. This opens up a field selection window that looks very much like the slicer window. Now I'm going to select the last order field. It'll only list fields that Excel identifies as dates. Pressing OK adds a new window that looks like a little timeline with the year and the months that are available in your dataset. This timeline, as I said, is basically a slicer that works with time and date values. You can see that the whole bar is blue and runs through December 2014. I can select any single month and see how my pivot table filters down based upon that selection. I can select and drag multiple months and see my pivot table update there too. I can quickly and easily clear the filter altogether to select all of the dates again. Now if I don't like the time segment I'm looking at, in this case it's months, I can click on this drop down and choose between years, quarters, months, and days. Of course, selecting days gives me hundreds of days to choose from, as it will cover the entire period in question. You can see how large this has become by looking at my slider bar and how quickly it moves as I drag it. Since this dataset is not heavily date driven, I'm going to go ahead and select my timeline and delete it, as we won't be needing this for our invoices. Many of the remaining tools are quite advanced and allow you to directly edit the queries, predefine sets, or even create pivot charts from the data. Of these, we will address pivot charts later in this chapter, but the rest of this material could constitute its own course discussing the different underlying types of pivot tables and how these features can be used with different types of datasets. This covers the basic functionalities of the pivot table, but let's go incorporate what we've learned about the data model, its interaction with the pivot table, and corresponding limitations, and correct for those using the Power Query Editor.